Hi, and welcome to the OpenSkies podcast. This is our very first standalone podcast on our own 2 feet again. And I am with my guest, Charles Duncan. Charles, welcome to the pod.
Chris, thanks for having me. It's great to be here, and I love the name, Open Skies. Many different meanings, and all of them positive. So great to be here.
Well, I have fond memories of X1 Get One and moving people around on the old OpenSkies platform that we used to use way back
Yeah,
in the day. So I have fond memories of the name, and that's one of the good reasons why we chose it.
that's awesome.
So, Charles, you were my absolute first podcast guest on the very first pod the very first version of the pod that we were doing. So I felt it'd be fitting to have you back again for our first standalone on Open Skies.
Well, thank you. I don't think I realized I was your first guest. I remember that very well, and I mean, sadly, you had pizza. I think some good Alberta beer. I mean, it
Right?
was it was an enjoyable evening. I remember it well. And anyway, but yeah, but anyway, so I'm honored. It's a privilege, and I'm excited to see where you take the podcast. Now as an independent Open Skies entity, it's exciting. But thank you, thanks for having me, and it's great to join you tonight.
Well, one of the things we want to do is tell kind of the untold stories behind the industry we love, right? Like you are a lifetime airline guy, and you've seen and done it all from low cost carriers to transatlantic to a combination between both.
Yep.
So this fits really, really well. So I'd like to get to talk to you about what you've been up to since the last time we talked. But for our listeners, why don't we go a little bit into your bio here and tell us how you started in the industry?
Yeah, look, my first role was in 1996, and for a long time, for I don't know, a decade, I was always like the youngest guy in the room. And I mean, I turned 50 this year, so clearly that's no longer the case. But my first job was at Continental Airlines, and I was a pricing and revenue management analyst in the Houston headquarters. And as part of that job, Continental in those days had three hubs: Newark, Houston, and Cleveland, and I was responsible for 110 daily flights
Wow.
in the Newark and Cleveland hubs, but working from Houston in markets like Newark, Cleveland, Providence, Newark, Richmond, short haul markets like this. And my job was to maximize revenue. And as a good av geek and brand new to the industry on the weekend, and I also in those days we still had paper tickets. E-tickets had not yet been invented, and there was a lot of no shows, a lot of fraud, a lot of weird things that happened. So we overbooked flights heavily. And so in those days in 96, 97, on my weekends for fun, I would go fly my markets and like observe the gate agents, observe
Yeah.
the passengers, and try to figure out with these what's the willingness to pay. Can I ratchet fares up a little bit more? Can I overbook the flights more aggressively? Would this gate agent in Providence be savvy at negotiating an oversale situation, or is it going to blow up and I'm going to have issues to account for? So anyway,
Because
that's
there's a
how it
fine
started.
line to getting that right, right? Where
So
you're
fine.
making maximum revenue, but not ticking people off too much.
That's exactly right. And anyway, so it was a great how do we say, sort of training ground, first role. I loved it, and so that's how I got into the business. That was my first job, 1996.
And now with Continental, that took you to a whole bunch of different places in the world, right? I believe Guam was where you spent a great deal of time.
Yeah, well, I mean, Guam was only 3 years, but in a lot of ways, I mean, kind of left my heart there. And I know you've got a love for the islands in Cuba and Caribbean, and I think
Right.
I have this sort of corollary in the Pacific. But basically, Continental had started a subsidiary called Air Micronesia. It was Guam based, and it grew out of really World War II and the Vietnam era, and Continental beat Pan Am for the rights to start this airline. And their commitment, and you'll love this, was, hey, we're going to start an airline. We're going to build tourist markets for Asians coming to these islands. But not only will we start an airline, we will hire local people and train them for flight attendants, pilots, mechanics, you name it, check-in agents. And Continental also committed for any island that wanted it, they would build a hotel to
Oh
support
wow.
the beginning of tourism in these markets. And so
Right.
across the Marshall Islands and Micronesia, Guam, Saipan. Continental did that. They built about 10 hotels. And this was actually, again, Vietnam era, 60s, 70s, into the 80s. And that business ended up being such a cash cow that it funded Continental, the cash it was generating funded Continental's exit from bankruptcy in the 1980s. So I
Wow.
showed up in the 1990s, after that era. But at Continental Micronesia, as it was then called, had about 1,000 employees. We flew everything from 747s to 727s, and we were serving Japan, Guam, Honolulu, all these island markets, the famous island hopper with between Guam and Hawaii with 7 stops. And there was an
Wow.
opening. So I was doing pricing and revenue management in '96 in Houston, and the Continental Micronesia subsidiary was looking to start doing revenue management. And so I was 23. The idea of living in Guam again, and knowing you, Chris, you would have been right there with me. I
Yep.
said, hey, this is an. I mean, to have a corporate job, the company relocated me out to Guam. Everyone around me in Houston thought I was absolutely insane. Guam is known as the Rock. At least it was in those days. Internally. And look, it's an 8-hour flight from Honolulu, right? So you're way isolated. And in those days, no internet. Phone calls were $2 US a minute. Back to the mainland. You were isolated. And in fact, you'll love this too. We would all the TV in Guam in those days was on VHS tapes 1 week late. So you'd see an NFL game and you'd walk into a bar and you'd say, well, who wins? Because you knew the result from the newspaper, but you're watching the game a week late on TV. So, I mean, even in the 90s, it was kind of like this really weird era, pre-technology and whatnot. And so I went out there for the adventure, young, single, a year out of school. And I stayed in Asia for 13 years. I was in Guam for 3 years and Tokyo for 10. And as part of that era, I mean, learned a ton. We flew from 10 cities in Japan to Guam. And we also started Continental's 777 service, the polar routes from Newark and Houston to places like Tokyo, Hong Kong, Beijing, Shanghai, Mumbai, Delhi, and I'm probably forgetting a couple. But so we were launching and building a trans-Pacific service for Continental as well as the Guam leisure business. And so I spent 13 years there. Met my lovely wife. My 2 kids were born in Tokyo. And so in 2010, late 2010, early 2011, when the merger between Continental and United happened, I was then called back to what was then the headquarters in Chicago after 13
Right.
years. So kind of married with 2 kids and very, very different, but loved that experience. Really, it was great.
Right. I'm thinking back when you talk about those VHS tapes in Cuba right now. They actually have a USB stick that they bring around
Okay.
a week later, and you can get all the programs
It's the
that
same
appeared
idea.
last week. They
Same
call
idea.
it,
Well,
yeah,
and I hear like the South Koreans will do that. They'll drop balloons over North Korea with USB sticks and things like that. It's the same idea. Yes, it's funny. It's funny how all that stuff works. But yeah. So that I mean, it wasn't that long ago, and the long distance phone company had a special on Sundays, and it was like the $2 rate became I don't know, like 50 cents or something, and so you made all your calls back to the mainland U.S. on Sundays. It's just again, in my lifetime, thinking now, I mean, you got Amazon deliveries and internet and free calls, and
yeah.
how much smaller the world has gotten, since then.
So yeah, it must have been such a big gamble, but not really when you're 23. But to be that isolated and to be that
Yeah,
out there.
you're right. I mean, look, it's funny, and my dad was in the U.S. Navy. We moved around a ton growing up. What's really funny, so this was 1997 when I moved to Guam, and there are two elements of this, or even we can dig deeper. But the same week I moved to Guam, my younger brother joined the Peace Corps and moved to West Africa. So my
Oh,
poor parents, were two boys, moved to opposite ends of the globe, and but I think it kind of is a bit of a demonstration that we have this international perspective, my brother and I,
yeah, the flavor.
adventurous as well. And look, I mean, moved out in '97. My first week on Guam. So sobering story. And I shared this a lot in my time at WestJet and elsewhere. But Korean Airlines had a fatal crash on the island. My third day
Yeah.
there, and this was a 747. They flew into the jungle, into a hill. The glide slope was down. There were a number of issues, but this was actually one of the first times where CRM, Career Resource Management, came to light, where the flight
Right.
engineer and the first officer from the transcripts from the voice cockpit voice recorder, you could tell they were sensing something wrong, but they didn't challenge the captain. And we were Korean Air's ground handler. And so not only did the tourism markets dry up, but we were dealing with the families who were coming in and representing Korean Air in that instance. And it really taught me, and I was running around getting cash from a bank, and I was too new in Guam to sort of be read into the emergency response plan, but it was drafted
Right.
very early. And we're booking, it was August, hotels were full, we're grabbing rooms for victims' families, and it really left a deep impression on me. 1 year into the business, of just the importance of planning and emergency response, and being ready for the unthinkable, because it certainly can happen. I mean, as safe as aviation is,
Yeah.
bad things can happen. So that was a real wake up call for me, early on in my time in Guam.
Wow, it seems like you got an incredible amount of experience in that short period of time.
Yeah, well, shorter. I mean, 13 years overall in Asia, but I was there. I was in Guam for a
Right.
year and a half, then 10 years in Tokyo, and then I moved back to Guam at the end of that period as president of the business of Continental Micronesia, and that was a privilege. And I must say, the people out there are fantastic, and I've got a lot of close friends on the island there. And again, I think, as I know you have a love for the Caribbean, my passions are similar, and just in the Pacific orientation, in that sense. But just love being out there. Just great people, great food, great culture, the geography, everything about it's just so fantastic.
See, my love isn't just for the Caribbean. I love Hawaii. I really like Tahiti. I highly
Is
recommend
that right? Hmm.
spending a lot of time there. There's only one problem with Tahiti is that I'm not rich.
I was
Um,
just going to say the problem is
yeah,
that it's expensive, right?
yeah,
So
and
and
the money is the problem, right? It's
it's
64,000. Um,
is it
fr-
South Pacific francs? Is it South
yeah.
something like the XPF? Yeah, yeah, the South
So when
Pacific.
you
They also use a Noumea as well, and the New Caledonia uses the same French currency. But Tahiti is expensive. So
you
and I
have no
and
idea how much the coffee is because
right
it's 64,000 Polynesian francs, and you find out you just bought a $24 coffee,
there you
So,
go.
yeah. So our paths crossed at WestJet
They did.
on the owner's mindset team. So
Yeah.
let's talk a little bit about your WestJet career, and I want to break it into two parts
Mm.
because there's the
COVID,
encore
post
WestJet
COVID.
side, and then there's the COVID side
Mhm.
of running Swoop. So
Mhm.
let's start with the encore journey and how we ended up on the same team.
Yeah, sure. And those are, I mean, look, I mean, I spent just over 5 years with WestJet up in Calgary, and that was a great period from 2017 through 2022. Um, I was hired in to be the president of WestJet Encore, which, great regional airline, coast to coast presence. When I came in, I think we had, roughly 35 or almost 40 aircraft, all Q400s. We built that fleet to 47. And just I mean, and that was part of the overall evolution of WestJet in terms of being a network carrier, needing regional feed, and also supporting the wide body growth and the 767s, which became 787s, and all that WestJet was doing in terms of kind of moving away from its sort of Southwest like routes to
Right.
being more of a an integrated network carrier with and so forth, and all that brings. So look, I thoroughly enjoyed my time there. Alberta is a great place. Love the mountains. I'm a skier. Loved WestJet, the airline, the culture, the people. And one of the fun things about being the president of WestJet Encore is that we served, I think it was 38 cities. I might be off by one or two. And so Greg Soretsky, our then CEO who hired me, put out a challenge, and I was up for it, and embraced this. But I visited all 38 cities, and he wanted to get out and do it. And what was funny, I think for the first couple of months, I was a bachelor before my family, joined me, with
Right.
selling the house and whatnot. So Greg's advice was, get out and visit all 38 right now before your family comes, because once they get here, you get it. And I realized that as you pencil this out, and if you don't know Canadian geography, but to get to St. John's and Sydney, Nova Scotia, and
Yeah.
Halifax, and over to Ottawa and Thunder Bay and all these places, I mean, it's a challenge. But the geography is wide and so forth. And I thought to myself, I mean, I could visit all 38 in a month, but it would be a blur, and I wouldn't have a memory of any of it. You
Yeah,
know,
it would just be seeing the airport and seeing a
yeah,
hotel and then hopping on a
it would
plane.
be ticking a box, and actually, I wanted to learn the business and the country. I was new to Canada, and these, I mean, even learning the airport codes was a challenge, right?
Right.
So I took it. I was much slower, much more deliberate. I think it took about 9 months or so. One thing I to this day log all of my flights, so I could go back and give you a very precise answer.
I copied that from you, by the way. I went
Oh, is that
back
right? Good for
and
you. Good
I've
for you.
charted every single flight I've ever taken. I had to go through
Nice.
Facebook. I had to go through, uh,
That's awesome.
yeah, and
Yeah,
I'm over
it's
750,000
such a great
kilometers. So,
that's such a great thing. So I do recall my very last city was Comox that I visited. But what I did on these visits as president of WestJet Encore was, I did each city as a standalone trip. So I did 38 standalone trips, and it was some combination. They were all a little bit different, but we would get the list of the top tier frequent flyers in the WestJet Rewards program, email them in advance and invite them to dinner. So we did that as like a sounding
oh,
board. So we did
cool.
that. I would typically go in to the local CBC or radio station and do like a more like
Right.
a drive-in radio show and kind of tell them the WestJet story. Never forget like doing this in like Whitehorse and Yellowknife at 3 in the morning and just being like walking myself to the studio and knocking on the door and November or whatnot. I remember going to Fort St. John on like December 21st, or something, like the shortest day of the year. And they're like, "What are you doing here? Why are you coming to visit us now?" But we would meet with our top tier frequent flyer programs. I would do some media visits. We typically would like have a luncheon with the Chamber of Commerce. Of course, we'd meet with the WestJetters, in the local city, meet with the mayor, or the MPs, other elected officials if they were in town. And we had sort of like a pretty good set format that I did 38 times, and it really allowed me to get to know the country, right? Because as an
Right.
American in Canada, I was very conscious of the fact that I before I didn't know. I couldn't have pointed out Terrace or Sydney on a map before I had taken on this role, and so now I know those places and I hold them dearly to this day, and they're great experiences and memories. And it's funny. One of the other things, speaking about being an American in Canada, never forget this, even to this day, and I know Alexis and the team at WestJet do this. As an executive, you make a PA, typically on the ground, and then introduce yourself to the guests in the airplane and tell them who you
Yeah.
are, what you do, and you help with service on the airplane. So I was on a transcon flight once, and halfway through, it was a Toronto Calgary flight probably, and halfway through the flight, the 4 hour flight, one of the guests in the airplane stops me and she says, "Hey, you're American, aren't you?" And I was like, I looked at her and I said, "What did I say?" I
What
like,
gave it
Yes,
away?
I am. What did I say?" And from my PA 2 hours ago was what I was thinking. She says, "It's nothing you said." She says, she looked at me and says, "It's your swagger. You walk like an American." And Chris, I was like, "Oh my gosh, here I am. I'm trying to like learn, Canadianisms and what the heck KD is and coffee crisp
Right.
and
Saying
chips
A
and
after every
ketchup
single word.
yeah, I mean, all of this stuff, right? And then I was like, man, I'm already self conscious of my vocabulary and pronunciations, and now I've got to think about how I walk. That was quite funny, but anyway, I love that experience, at WestJet Encore, truly did. Yeah, I mean, it was just a fantastic time, and really did afford me the chance to get to know the company and the country and my role, in the company there. Yeah.
So, telling the truth now you're no longer with Encore. You're not going to offend anybody. Out of those 38, which was your favorite city?
Oh my gosh, I truly can't pick one. Because the country is so cool. I mean, there's so many neat things. I mean, Penticton is awfully unique. Love that one.
Right.
Um, Comox was also really cool. Love hearing the stories up there, and the Maritimes. I mean, you name it. And even, I mean, gosh, things like, I mean, and I would fly a Q400 from Calgary to Toronto via Edmonton, Regina,
Huh.
Winnipeg, and Thunder Bay. I mean, I would take all day,
Yeah, there's
across
not
the
a lot of
country.
direct flights.
No, in a Q400, and that was a privilege. I mean, it really, really was. So,
Well, that's
um,
cool.
I truly, yeah, I mean, I don't have a favorite, truly, but man, I mean, there's just so many cool places in the country, to go out and see it.
Now, and then after Encore,
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
we got to work on the continuous improvement team,
Get it. Yeah.
and focus really on trying to find ways to eliminate waste and eliminate costs. Uh, so tell me a little bit about how you approach that and how you set that team up, because it was your brainchild to start with when I
Yeah,
joined
yeah,
the
yeah.
team.
Well, and to be honest, like a lot of things in a career, and I'm almost 30 years in now. You kind of rip off or borrow things you've seen before, or elsewhere and whatnot. So to set the stage, that was 2018, and Continental, WestJet had been the most profitable airline in the industry, like in the most consecutive quarters, more than Southwest. And I forget, I mean, something like 24 years of every single quarter in,
Yeah,
quarter out being profitable. But at that point, as we were, in the first half of 2018, the trend lines were not in our favor. Revenues were not increasing very rapidly, and costs really were. And so Ed Sims had been named CEO at that point in time, and he asked me to change roles to become the chief strategy officer. And we created this team. Ultimately, he said, "Look, I mean, when we had our finance guys look at the trends." The story was we need to improve profitability, and it didn't matter revenue or costs by $200 million annually. And
right.
so realizing, and we were, roughly a $5 billion company, as I recall at the time. So $200 million is a lot of money, to anybody. And what do we do? We actually said, okay, let's do this over 3 years. In year one, let's get 60. In year two, we'll get 120, and then we'll, ramp up and get the final 80 in year three. And so we started that in 2018 with a goal to finish the work in 2020. And I'll never forget. And WestJet was really fond of like post-it notes, and a lot of our folks, from different projects and different leading programs and whatnot. But we gathered together our executive team. Of each of the EVPs appointed one person. So we had originally started with about 5 or 6 people in a room, and we literally spent with kind of the best and brightest 3 days just writing ideas on post-it notes, and then we try to categorize them, and very, very roughly, they were categorized around, I mean, how much do we think this is worth? Is it worth $1 million or $50 million? And then how difficult will it be, challenging time wise to
Yeah,
go get it, get the money. So we sort of had then a matrix of, easy, hard, quick, and so forth. And then we broadened the team out, and worked with you and the continuous improvement team, and we did so many cool things.
yeah,
And one of them, I mean, that like maybe is like so bizarre. WestJet had such a great culture, and 90% of the employees were owners in the company and owned, had stock equity in the business, and so they had always been empowered to do the right thing for the guest. And then it actually, over 20 years, had morphed into doing some really bad habits. And so as an example, we told all the staff we were making $3 in profit per guest on the airplane, which shocked people. And we said that's less than the cost of like 2 cups of Tim Hortons coffee. Right, that was how
yeah.
we dimensionalized it, which people in the states love that Tim Hortons coffee. Like the reference, because it's hard to find Tim's down here. It's
Right.
here, but it's hard to find. So at any rate, our staff were shocked, and then we also said, look, when you wave a bag, and a bag would be $30, to check in. I think, not you've now wiped out the $3 profit for the guest in front of you, but also for the next 9 guests you see,
Yeah,
to make up for that. And our staff were shocked. And so we created some scorecards so that the airport managers could see how much waiving of fees was going on to try to, sort of stop the leaking, if you will. And don't get me wrong, there are, were that and still are legitimate reasons to waive the fee. But the point is, let's be consistent and only do it when it's truly warranted. We had staff who were like, man, I like that shirt. I got the same one. I'm going to, yeah, this bag fee's on me, kind of a thing. And it
yeah,
was just without recognizing what the impact was in the business. So we really went after revenue collection in that way. We did a whole war room, and all this, I know, but for your listeners, you're focusing on fuel efficiency, and we had, gosh, probably easily 15 or 20 different initiatives around fuel, which we were tracking on a daily basis. But getting the data was a real challenge. Everything from APU usage to single engine taxi performance to how much potable water we were carrying. And we even looked at, and this was shocking to me, we were loading 12 servings of beverage per guest on every flight. And even on a Calgary Edmonton flight where we wouldn't even serve the beverages, we were
Yeah.
loading the equivalent of 12 servings per guest on the airplane on those flights. And so,
I remember the hackathon where
yeah,
we took everything off the plane,
we weighed everything and
weighed
put it on a scale.
everything that wasn't locked
We
down.
had
Yeah.
binders in the cockpit that the flight ops guys use, and you know what? And an iPad can cover this, can cover that, and we weighed everything. That was great. I mean, so we had a hackathon. We went after fuel. We also we had a lot of religion around labor efficiency and how do we staff our agents, both above the wing and below the wing. And gosh, I mean, those are the ones off the top of my head. That's been now, gosh, what, 6 years ago, and I remember it almost, like yesterday. But what's
Yeah.
great about that? Our year one goal was $60 million, and as I recall, I think we hit 64 in year one. And for
Yes.
year two, we also exceeded the $120 million goal we had for 2019. And then sadly, 2020 happened, and we had the COVID pandemic and air travel in Canada. The revenue line dropped by 90%, and it stayed there for an awful long time. So then we had to go and furlough and shrink, and did a lot of really, really painful things.
Right.
So sadly, and then we started losing money, of course, as well. So our whole profit transformation owner's mindset program ended in early 2020, which is sad. But we had a lot of fun together. I know, and it was a great program.
Well, and just I remember being out there at all the gates, talking to ground crews about APU and hooking up hoses and hooking up ground power, and you were there with me doing the exact same thing. So it was a fun time to get boots on the ground and to start really seeing those change initiatives take place. It was fun
It was.
once you started to see people starting to do it out of habit as opposed
Yep.
to being asked, and you could really see that change
No,
happening in
it's
front of you.
And I think a lot of that too with anything. I mean, one, people want to be on a winning team and they want to know what the score is, and so just
Yep.
creating scorecards and creating a momentum around it, was really, really positive. And like I said, we had a similar program. It was called Project Quality at United, and I think it had a $1 billion target. And we had done a lot of the same things at United. And so, I mean, to be honest, I mean, these were not, for the most part, original ideas of
Yeah.
mine. But we got the best and brightest together at WestJet, and we did it in a WestJet way. And certainly we did have some original ideas, but it's fun when you get a small group together with a goal and some empowerment. And man, that team was. We should actually probably do a reunion and get that whole group together. That'd be a lot of
Absolutely.
fun.
It
Good
was a
rest. Yeah,
scrappy team.
it was a great team. It really was a fantastic team. So they know who they are. I won't name them out here on the call, but they certainly know.
Most of them are going to listen to this pod.
I,
So
I, I have I have no doubt. I have no doubt.
shout out to the owner's mindset team. You guys know who you are out there.
And the only question is, do we have the party in Virginia where I live now, or I'm happy to fly to Calgary and do it up there on that side. So
I think the challenge is accepted. We are going to have a reunion,
let's
and
do it.
Charles is
Let's
going
do
to
it.
fly in for it.
Okay.
Now, speaking of scrappy teams,
Mm,
in my previous role with Flight, I was able to work with Swoop and
yeah.
see how kind of scrappy that team was, for lack of a better term, like a very
Mm,
plucky
yep.
group of individuals really trying to change things.
Yeah.
And you had the luxury of leading that team for a while. So why don't you talk a little bit about your time with Swoop and how that went?
Yeah, well, listen, I mean, that was a really tough time, I must say. So I was asked to lead again. Ed Sims had promoted me, as I said, in 2018 into the strategy role. And Yeah, I'm sure that was 2018. And then, of course, a year and a half later, we're in COVID, making sure I'm getting the chronology right. Boy, it was tough. So, a month into COVID, I was asked to run Swoop in addition to, continuing the strategy work. And I mean, honestly, I mean, the airline at that point had been flying for 2 years. We had 10 aircraft. And you're right. I mean, really scrappy team, and really focused on doing the ULCC models, having ultra low costs, and liberating travel. And as WestJet had gotten larger and more complex and higher cost, frankly, it had left a gap in the market that WestJet wanted to address and compete in. And so it was a real privilege to lead that team and do it. But I must say, it was under really challenging
Of course.
circumstances. When I got in, we had so many fits and starts with the government, changes in government policy and is it safe to travel or not. But in April of 2020, we did a through flight, and gosh, we had a cute name for it. I'm forgetting it now off the top of my head, but we literally took the four main bases for Swoop. So and we just did one airplane that would fly. I think we're doing it
Ugh,
3 times a week. And yes, it would start in Abbotsford, go to Edmonton, Edmonton to Hamilton, Hamilton to Halifax, and it was just to keep the lights on, and to have essential
yeah.
service across the country, keep the airplanes exercised, if you will. We got great support from airports. The Halifax airport, I think, actually gave us free hotel rooms for the crew who were overnighting. It was one of those moments of just kind of the whole industry um, pulling together, and of course Parm, who I know is a regular guest on the pod, was a
I knew
huge.
Parm was coming up at
He
some
had
point in
to.
this
Well,
pod.
if I didn't mention Parm, I would get hate mail later because I know he's listening as well. But Parm, I mean, we got great support from Parm, and really, I mean, all of our partners, Myron up in Edmonton and Kathy in Hamilton as well. I mean, those are the four really big important airports.
Right.
For Swoop, but it was a tough time, and what's
Yeah.
funny, I mean, I try to explain to friends of mine, colleagues here on this side of the border, on the US side, about what it was like to run an airline, to be in the industry during COVID. And look, it wasn't easy in the States, but I would submit it was probably 10 times more challenging in Canada. The lack of government aid and support. I mean, WestJet never got a dollar, whether be loan or aid, or the U.S. carriers got $50 billion as a gift in the first 3 months,
Yeah.
and so Ottawa never came forth with support, and then really kind of tamped down on travel, such that a year and a half later it was still kind of frowned upon, and it really made it tough to run airlines. So that was a tough time for all of us, the Swoop team, and I'm happy we were able to sort of really just keep the lights on.
Yeah.
If I'm honest about that, yeah, it was really really tough.
And from Swoop, you ended up going where on your next step?
Well, yeah. So look, I mean, what I would say too is while
You're
I was
slowly
president.
moving more north. That's from Guam to
Well, for no.
Canada to.
So listen, during my, I think of my WestJet time in sort of two halves. There was the pre and the post COVID. So during COVID, I continued being sort of effectively chief strategy officer, and as you well know, we went out and negotiated the purchase of Sunwing Travel. So that was
Yes.
me and my team, and so I was doing that, and it was at the time very secretive and all under non-disclosure agreements and these kinds of things. And then I was also tapped and asked to run the cargo team, and we went out and converted four 737-800s into freighters, and we're building that. We were also flying some 787s for cargo only flights, as well. And again, I mean, it was when I was first asked to do those three jobs, if you will, simultaneously. This would have been in March of 2020.
Wow.
I thought it seems so funny. Oh, this COVID thing, it's going to be done by summer. So by June, July, I'll go back to doing one role. And it stretched on, as you know, for a couple of years. And so as 2022 came around, for a whole host of reasons, and all just family and personal ones, really. We made a family decision. We needed to get back to the States.
Yeah.
My kids are athletes. They were playing basketball, and the YMCA's and school sports were still canceled in Alberta. And so I moved back to my hometown, and where my parents are still living in Virginia Beach, which is a Navy town. I mentioned that, in
Right.
growing up. And so we moved in the summer of 2022. And yeah, I've been kind of working from home and doing a whole bunch of different things, from there since. It's been just over 2 years.
Now, one of those things that you were doing uh, was president at Norse.
Hmm.
So tell me a little bit about that experience, because completely different model, completely a different approach from what you ran in Canada. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, yes and no. And it's funny. I've been privileged to be the president of four different airlines. So first was Continental Micronesia and Guam, and then president of WestJet Encore, and then Swoop, and then Norse Atlantic. And so this was, there's been much ink spilled on the long haul, low cost business model. Starting with Laker Airways, I think Sir Freddie Laker, and late '70s, early '80s, flying from the UK to Florida. And look, I mean, no, I mean, the jury is sort of still out. I mean, there's much debate. Can anyone be successful at this financially? Um,
Yes.
and it's easier to be a ULCC with short stage lengths and focused on rapid turns and so forth. When you get into longer stage lengths, it's harder to be lower cost and so forth. I do think it can be done. And look, I mean, I would point to AirAsia X, Scoot, I think is doing fairly well. Jetstar, is airline within an airline, but doing fairly well. So I mean, there are some examples, and critics can certainly shoot arrows and argue with me on that. But I met the founder and CEO of Norse Atlantic, a guy named Bjorn Tora Larson, who is a shipping magnate. He's a high school dropout who at Norwegian, who at 17 went out to sea and
Huh.
learned the shipping business and ended up coming back to shore and buying ships, setting up a business. He has an amazing company with a large presence in India and the Philippines and Cyprus, and in addition to Norway. And he staffs actually. I know you like cruises. I mean, it is a good
Yeah.
chance the staff on the cruise ship work for BT Larson and his shipping companies because he's a staffing agency as well as a ship manager and so
Wow.
forth. And he's also a private pilot. And he holds a type rating on the 747, as a matter of fact, as well. So he had the idea.
Lot of fish, lot of
Oh,
pans on the oven.
oh
Yeah.
yes. So great guy, and he had the idea while I was running Swoop in Canada and doing other COVID related things. He had the idea of, and he learned this in shipping, that all of these wide bodies were parked. The lessors were desperate to sign a customer. He negotiated a sweetheart deal for 15 787s at half price in effect.
Yeah.
Crazy discounts, and they were even also in the beginning 18 months power by the hour. So don't fly them, don't pay the lessor a thing. And then
Wow.
just because these
That
planes
was the
were
time.
grounded, needed
Yeah.
somebody, and he learned. And Ryanair has done similar things. You buy aircraft at the bottom of the market, don't buy them at the top, and that was. He's made a fortune in shipping doing this. So set up the company in 2021, started flying in 2022, June of 22, and quickly learned, I think, that I mean, it's a tough business, and you can only stimulate so much with low fares and so on. So I met BT, the CEO, after he'd been flying for about 6 months, and we hit it off. He's a great guy, and he was looking for someone who had the experience I had to marry up with him. So I was president of that airline from my home office in Virginia, and flying over to Europe once a month, and the
Nice.
U.S. market is the biggest point of sale, so it's not quite as crazy as it sounds or seems. But Gatwick and JFK are the two biggest airports, and so it's a lot of transatlantic flying. And look, I mean, what I'll tell you, Chris, is that it's a tough business model, and the critics are not wrong. It's a tough business,
Right.
and so I was served as president in 2023. I've stepped back, and I'm very much in a part time role as an executive advisor now to Norris, but still pretty much every day, working for them, helping them, and what fundamentally the North Atlantic works in the summer. The model works. Norris is profitable. The challenge is the winter, and the
Yeah.
challenge is also traffic rights and securing them. And so I've been working on helping them solve the winter challenge, if you will. Finding ACMI and charter customers, and helping to think through partnerships and thinking through traffic rights, and places that can be counter seasonal. It's not like Canada where you've got
Yeah.
a strong summer and a strong winter. You've got to change the network, right?
Right.
So that was a real lesson of flying to sun markets in the winter. And that's certainly something that Norris is working on doing.
Well, that's pretty exciting, but it's not as exciting as your latest venture
What's that?
because uh, you have joined the realm of podcasting.
Oh,
So I want you to tell me a little bit about your podcasting
yeah,
career, and
absolutely.
uh, you're not total competition, but
No,
we're in the
definitely not.
same world
Definitely not.
here.
So let me. And before I get to that, just a couple things. So I'm actually, if you count podcasting, which I really almost don't, but I'm doing four things for my home office right now. So I mentioned I'm, I mean, still advising Norris part time. I'm also an adjunct professor. I'm teaching an MBA course at my alma mater. It's an operations strategy course, and I
Wow.
thoroughly enjoy that. And then I'm also working with. A dear friend of mine and former boss who retired as COO at United. He set up a private equity investment firm
Oh
that's called
wow.
Altitude X, and we are investing in aviation businesses. And so we partnered with a private equity firm to buy an ab initio flight and AME training academy that's in Texas. It's called Thrust.
Yeah.
We also are property developers at an airport in Colorado, the Colorado Air and Spaceport, and we're looking to acquire other aviation businesses. We're looking right now at a couple that's exciting. So I'm doing that, and then you're right. The fourth thing is
The
podcasting.
fourth is
So,
podcasting.
I don't. Yeah, my wife, who is also kind of working from home, looks at me and is like, "How do I keep it all straight?" Because I'm doing a little bit of everything every day, but very much enjoying it. This podcast that I've aligned myself with is called Airlines Confidential, and again, I think the more podcasts we can have in this industry, the better.
I
Frankly.
agree.
So, and I listen to as many as I can on my drives and things in the car. So, Airlines Confidential was started by a former boss of mine. At Continental Airlines called Ben Beldanza. And Ben was EVP of marketing when I joined as a revenue management analyst in 1996. And then Ben went on to work at Taka, US Air. He was at UPS before. And he was famously the CEO of Spirit. And he was the driving force in changing Spirit into a ULCC, and was sort of the grandfather of that. I'll say in the U.S. market, doing a lot of Michael O'Leary type of things. He's a really funny guy, great personality. He went on to teach a course at George Mason University, and it's just one of these people, gregarious, full of life, happy to explain the business to anyone. Would give you the shirt off his back, kind of a guy, just a fantastic guy. You would love him, Chris. So Ben started the Airlines Confidential podcast 5 years ago, and sadly, about a year and a half or 2 years ago, or maybe even longer, but I became aware he was diagnosed with ALS, and so he has been, it's a terrible disease. I don't know a lot about it, but degenerative. And so about 3 months ago, he had to stop hosting his podcast, and there was always a host and a co-host. And the co-host most recently was Scott McCartney, who's a Wall Street Journal reporter who knows the business really,
Right.
really well. And so when Ben had to step back from the podcast, Scott's idea was to tap eight different people, and I'm one of eight, to be a co-host with him. And some of the co-hosts, are over the tops. We have Doug Parker, former CEO of American Airlines. We've got Oscar Munoz, former CEO of United.
Right.
My old boss, Dave Hilfman, who ran sales for years and a really, really fun guy at Continental. The CEO of the Pittsburgh Airport is there, and I know I'm forgetting several, but there are eight of us. I'm one of eight, and so the first episode that I'm co-hosting dropped this week. So I'm not sure when this will actually drop, but it's out there. And yeah, so having some, yeah. Listen, I mean, and for me, I'm just so happy. I reached out to Scott when they announced Ben stepping down. He was actually using an AI voice for a time because he couldn't.
Right.
It
Because
was
you
too
lose
early.
control.
And so I just said, listen, if I can help you guys keep this going, let me know. And I
Right.
didn't know what that meant, but I mean, I can help. And I know a lot of people. I can reach out and book guests. I can help you do some research. I mean, if you need help, however, but let's keep this going for the industry because they've got
Right.
a big audience. And again, I just didn't, and then sadly, I woke up this morning and learned of Ben's passing. And that just was a bizarre coincidence. It's the same day that the episode that I'd recorded was also dropping. So anyway, just a sad day, and just I mean a larger than life figure, and just a super super human being. who cared about the industry a lot and would just stop at nothing to explain things to people, help others out. In fact, I mean, I reached out to Ben before I joined Norse Atlantic and said, "Hey, what do you think?" And, Bjorn Tora, the CEO, good guy, bad guy, am I crazy to go jump? He's like, "Go for it, Charles. You should do this." So he was somebody that I would
He's a
reach out
mentor.
to, and I know many many others did, as well. Anyway, so
There's not many people that have actually changed the industry. There's a lot of people that come in and
yep,
keep the status quo, and that's
right.
okay. You need that. You need that continuity. But having somebody challenge the status quo like he did
Hmm.
at Spirit uh, forced a lot of airlines to adapt their models and to
Yeah.
uh,
No, no,
like
I think that's right. And look, I mean, he was all about driving ancillary revenue and crazy low fares. And he made a point when reporters came to his office, he was like vacuuming his office himself, like there was no custodial service in the office. And and look, I mean, I think he took quite a bit of flack. Like he wouldn't give refunds, and he was very hard edged about the only way to make this model work is the rules are the rules. For example,
discipline.
and there were some heartbreaking cases that got some media attention where he wouldn't bend. And I mean, I honestly, when I was running Swoop, took a lot of those lessons with me, and tried to kind of run it the way Ben did. And that's not the way that a WestJet would, or a United, or the
Yeah,
other network carrier. And so you've got to kind of know your business model and what you're, ultimately, what you're, how do you make money and what are you trying to do and achieve and so forth. And
right,
certainly even at Norse, I mean, I tried to, bring up, some of those same things. Again, on long haul, a little bit different, and we had a premium cabin as well. But still, if you don't collect the ancillary revenue, the business doesn't work, and that becomes really important. Just like we taught those WestJet agents, so many years ago.
right. So we're just about out of time.
Oh no!
I know this could go on for a lot longer, but
Absolutely.
one thing I wanted to touch base on, because you had reached out to me on LinkedIn after one of my podcasts
Yes.
where we held a roundtable in Abbotsford, and we were talking about affordability
Yep.
and what's going on in the Canadian space. So I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, how healthy is Canada, and uh, do
Mm.
you think the competitive landscape is going to be sustainable with Porter expanding as much as they have, with
Yeah.
Flair's ambitious expansion, and with WestJet and Air Canada fighting tooth and nail to make sure they keep their market share? How do you feel the air industry in Canada is?
Yeah. So I look. It is a great question, Chris. Look, what I would say is that and I mean, I've been up a couple of times, and one of the great things, I mean, I became a Canadian citizen while I was working for WestJet, so I proudly have my Canadian passport, and hope certainly look forward to living and working up in Canada again, and hope I
Right,
have that privilege. And it really was a privilege, to be there and love love that I was able to, sort of latch on again. I tie it back to the travel and whatnot. So, look, man, I would answer your question um, from two different points of view. I think the market is very competitive. And you mentioned, I mean, certainly the duopoly structure with Air Canada and WestJet, but also the Porter and Flair dynamic. And I mean, there's great competition. Not clear to me. It's great for consumers. Not clear how profitable it is for those airlines.
right,
We used to say, and this is maybe a little bit dated, but I mean, the Canadian market with 30 odd million people, and this huge, vast distances, and the lack of density, reasonably can sort of support two and a half airlines. And you didn't mention Transat, who are struggling right now,
right.
having their own challenges that are documented in the press. We thought the country can support two and a half airlines. So you've got the two, and the question of who's the half,
Right.
um,
And
and
what segment it's it going to come from? Because
well,
like
yeah, and
Porter and Flair are
oh,
two
very
different
different
segments.
ends, and so look, at the end of the day, let the market decide, let the consumer decide. I mean, I would argue, with Porter, Flair, Transat, it's too much capacity. It's too much, and of course, I mean, the government and competition authorities want as many as possible, but you've got to be realistic, in that.
Right.
And so and we would benchmark the size of fleets relative to the U.S. and various things, and it kind of tended to validate that sort of two and a half carrier sort of mindset. But the other way, so I think it's competitive, and I think the history, and it certainly is true in the U.S. Carriers will fail. That's okay. We saw it this year with Lynx, and I loved your interview with Jim Sullivan, and I've gotten to know him personally as a result of
Great
your
guy.
podcast. He
Yeah.
is, and so, I mean, look, at the end of the day, it's always going to be competitive. Companies are going to succeed. They're going to fail. That's the normal course of things. And you hate to see people impacted, of course, through that, but that's competition, and the way things work. But what I think is really sick in Canada and needs to be addressed is government policy and the regulatory regime and so forth. And I know you've interviewed Parm, and God bless him and the Abbotsford Airport and being low cost, but the AIF fees that are tacked onto
Yeah.
tickets at airports are far too high. They're 30, 40, $50 Canadian per ticket per passenger. It's way too high. The airports are paying crown rent to the federal government in Ottawa for just the right of having the airport. That shouldn't happen. I mean, those funds aren't supporting aviation; they're just going to the federal treasury, as I understand it. And then, furthermore, what just appalled me a couple of weeks ago was the CTA, I guess, recommendation or proposal
Yeah.
to charge the airlines 790 or 799, or let's call it 800 Canadian for every single APPR complaint, whether the airline's at fault or not, but to
Whether
bill the
it's a
airlines,
valid complaint or not.
which is
Yeah.
supposedly not even the cost of what it costs the CTA to process one of these things, which would also cause me to question, like, what on earth is happening to government efficiency there. So look, I mean, I think commercially it feels vibrant, it's competitive, and I think that again, there's probably more capacity than there ought to be, but let the market sort that out. But I think that government policy, as relates to airports and regulation and APPR, all these things, it's broken in my mind, and
Yeah.
ultimately all of that adds to cost, and when Canadians rightly ask, why does it cost so much to fly domestically? A lot of it does relate back to, these fees and taxes, and, yeah, having them talk about CATSA. I mean, all these agencies, NAV Canada, it appalls me. You look at pull up Flight Radar, or, your favorite ADSB tracking stat, the transcontinental flights across Canada fly over US airspace. And a large reason for that is because the overfly
Cheaper.
fees the FAA charges are less than NAV Canada.
Yeah.
Like, that's a problem, right?
Yeah.
The US infrastructure is cheaper. Yes, we've got bigger population in the US and the density. But Canada is not competitive, from a cost point of view in terms of that infrastructure. And so I mean, that worries me. It really does.
we we treat airports so differently than treating roads and bridges, and
Yeah.
like in Canada there's no real toll roads,
Right.
yet there's a toll airport everywhere we go, and
Hmm.
it's such a key driver for economics in the cities that get service and whatnot.
Yep.
It, I could ask 10 different people and get 10 different opinions on how airlines should work in Canada, but the one constant between everybody that I talk to is the regulatory situation here in Canada, and the fact it needs to change, whether it's an academic or
Yep.
whether it's the president of a ULCC or the president of a legacy carrier. It's the same complaint, and it does need to change.
Yeah, and I know recently there was an aviation day in Ottawa that was hosted by IATA, and I think the airport council, or there's a new transport minister, but I mean, radical change is needed on that front, and I think, ultimately, and you said it, and I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, you need to, like, just flip the whole thinking on its head. Airports are economic drivers.
Yeah.
And look, Singapore gets this, Dubai gets this,
Yep.
it effectively, and I mean, this is, a little bit old and dated, but I mean, it's free to land an airplane in Dubai, right? And it doesn't, it's similar in Singapore. The governments there want to subsidize the airport because it brings so much other economic activity, and they'd look and say, you're foolish to tax this, yeah, it's terrible. So I mean, I'm hoping. At some point in my lifetime, we'll see a reversal of these AIF fees. Because look, I mean, the equivalent in the U.S. is capped at 450 US, so whatever, that's probably
Yeah.
7 Canadian. Um, yeah, it's there. So what? It's 5-6 times more expensive on the Canadian side, and that's just one line item fee. So
Well, Charles, that's the time I have. I could literally talk to you for 3 or 4 hours, but this is the time we have booked today. Thank you so much for doing this. You helped launch my podcast career, so it's only fitting that you're the very first standalone Open Skies podcast episode.
yep. Hey, well, you're kind to say that, and dear friend, and I wish you the best of luck with Open Skies. I mean, for sure. And yeah, I'll be a loyal listener, and wish you the best of luck with this, Chris. Thank you.
We're going to have some great episodes coming up, so please stay tuned and follow us along on LinkedIn and at openskiesmediahouse.com.